After the birth of the biological and psychological traditions, psychology was beginning to be seen as a legitimate branch of medicine. The biological model, with its emphasis on physical interventions, began to change thinking about mental illness and how it should be treated. We pick up our story in the 20th century. For patients with mental illness, the biological tradition came as a double-edged sword. On the one hand, mental illness was now seen as a medical condition like any other illness, but the psychological well-being of patients was often neglected. Treatments for mental health concerns were still in their early days and often had extreme side effects. Before the 20th century, drugs delivered in asylums were primarily sedatives. But by the 1950s, drug treatments were beginning to be mass-produced and were heralded as a one-size-fits-all cure for mental illness. Opium was replaced with barbiturates such as luminol, although unbeknownst to the doctors, these drugs were equally as addictive as the opium that it was replacing. A number of new drugs were also invented between the 1930s to 1950s, including lithium, which is still used today to treat bipolar, chlorpromazine, also known as Largactil, which is also still used today to treat psychosis, and imipramine, which was the first antidepressant. Once doctors realised that they could target different psychological symptoms with different medical interventions, it really helped put psychiatry in line with other branches of medicine. Society was now taking mental illness seriously. But these are all really strong drugs, and they were being given out routinely to virtually all patients in asylums right up until the 1950s. It's probably little wonder that medical interventions are still stigmatised. Most of these people didn't need these drugs, and that distrust is still being felt today. Other physical interventions like the lobotomy were even more extreme. This surgery involved drilling into the front of the skull and haphazardly cutting out bits of the frontal lobe. In some cases, the lobotomy helped to pacify violent patients, but this was most likely because the person now had brain damage. At the time, some treatments were thought to reset the brain, a bit like a Control-Alt-Delete reboot. The most dangerous and now discontinued insulin coma therapy involved injecting a massive dose of insulin to rapidly drop blood sugar levels and induce a coma. The other intervention made popular during this time was electroconvulsive shock therapy, or ECT. ECT involves sending an electrical current through the brain to induce a seizure, and it seems to work by changing the way certain neural and chemical systems function. And it actually remains the most effective treatment for people with severe treatment-resistant depression. From pretty dubious beginnings, ECT can actually now offer people hope when all other treatment options have failed. Alongside the biological tradition, a number of theorists at the turn of the century began to see mental illness as being caused not by a chemical imbalance, but by a disruption of thoughts and emotions. Sigmund Freud was one of these early champions of the psychological tradition and is often touted as the grandfather of psychology. Freud's psychodynamic theory centered on the idea that mental health problems arise due to unconscious psychological conflicts. Now, at the time, the idea that a person could be affected by factors outside of their awareness was both revolutionary and controversial. Freud conceived of the unconscious mind as being divided into three parts: the id, which controls our basic drives like hunger, sleep, and sex; the ego, which attempted to balance the drives of the id with the demands of reality; and the superego, which is essentially a person's conscience. Freud theorized that abnormal behavior and mental illness resulted from these unconscious psychic entities not being satisfied at certain psychosexual stages in a child's development. This in turn resulted in the development of defense mechanisms to protect the mind from distress. So, for example, in Freud's oral stage, a baby's id is driven to suck. According to Freud, if this drive is either undersatisfied or oversatisfied, then a person would become fixated in this stage, resulting in abnormal behaviours such as thumb-sucking in older children and nail-biting in adults. In therapy, Freud used techniques like free association and dream analysis to try to tap into the dark recesses of a person's unconscious and resolve a person's unconscious conflicts in a process he called catharsis. Freud's work influenced a number of other theorists, including his students Carl Jung and Alfred Adler, both of whom rejected most of the sexual aspects of psychoanalytic theory. Instead, Jung and Adler's theories encouraged the person to remove psychological and social obstacles that prevented them from achieving their full potential, which they called self-actualizing. The work of Jung and Adler eventually led to the advent of humanistic psychology, which was championed by therapists such as Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. No relation, no. Maslow proposed that humans have a hierarchy of needs, and outlined that a person's high-level needs such as love, self-esteem, and self-actualization cannot be achieved if their basic biological and psychological needs for food, shelter, and safety are not met first. Carl Rogers took a slightly different approach, using person-centered therapy, which focused on allowing the person to talk through their problems to find their own solutions. Now, in its purest form, person-centered therapy has limited effectiveness for serious mental health concerns, but many aspects of this method, including showing unconditional positive regard for the client, remain important parts of modern psychotherapy and counselling. In the past few decades, psychoanalysis and humanistic psychology have been justifiably criticised by psychological scientists because, as we will see in the next video, these theories are largely unscientific. But what do I mean by this? All will be revealed in our next video, The Scientific Method.